Now, let's look at this. South Africans are reaching boiling point over prolonged power cuts and water shortages. Often, these frustrations spill out onto the streets. In fact, it seems it's the only way to get government's attention. Let's discuss how authorities should respond with Saths Cooper from the Pan-African Psychology Union. A very good morning, Professor. Thank you so much for making the time. Firstly, let's just unpack the mind of a protester. What is the motivation behind the protesters, would you say?
Well, look, first of all, I think it takes a lot of guts to become a protester, because you end up being somebody who results in a lot of change happening. And in one way or the other, you are identifying and articulating something that maybe a larger group of people feel, but are too scared or too otherwise occupied to want to come out in their numbers to act in solidarity. And that results in some of the pictures we're seeing on our screen, where people do the kinds of things to gain attention and to get the people in charge to respond. Now, I think we have enough intelligence out there to know when things are reaching boiling point, but the authorities simply don't care. They don't, in fact, intervene with communities. We have all sorts of layers of government. We have enough city councillors, we have enough members of the provincial legislature, and we have enough politicians who sit in parliament. But at all levels, these fail us because nobody interacts with the community. So a community is left on its own resources, and young people tend to be the majority in that situation, much like what happened in June 16, 1976. It was young people who took to the streets of Soweto and then elsewhere in the country to raise their objections to a system that was clearly not meeting their needs, a system that was oppressive. Now, in many ways, you can draw the parallels between that and now, because we have a group of people in power who tend to hide, who tend to allow things to get out of control, and then it becomes the city police, it becomes the South African police services who have to end up dealing with what the Provincial Commissioner for Gauteng, Elias Mawela, said many years ago in Parliament, that these are community-related, these are socioeconomic related issues that don't get attended to and then spill out in the streets. That situation still obtains. He's now the provincial commissioner. At that time, I think he was in charge of public order policing. So we don't have a responsive set of administrators in our country at all levels, at the city level, at the town level, and higher up. We have people who, during COVID in particular, were the only ones assured of their salaries, as they still are. And more people are out of work. We have the highest unemployment rates in the world and the lowest employment rates in the world. So go figure. How do people have to have their voices heard? They don't have the structures within which, at a local level, they can have their issues discussed, getting answers. Nobody gives them answers. And this is a sickening process of protest after protest after protest. It ends up with eventually people turning to the anger that we often see protests end up with. They burn things that they should not be burning. But how else, as your opening comments, how else do you have yourself heard?
And obviously, Professor, I mean, just when you observe human behavior, we often say, and we speak of this notion that hurt people. So I imagine there are problems that protesters themselves are facing. You've just touched on, and thank you for elaborating, what spurs them on. But I imagine there are particular societal problems that a protester is facing, and the only way of lashing out in this context would be to block others from leaving the community to go to their place of work, to get to school on time, etc., or even coming back, because some of the protests last over a day. So even people coming back from work, making the commute back into the community, that blockage seems to be a win for the protesters, because it's an objective that they've achieved. We've managed to disrupt the order of things on the day. Talk to me about the problems that the protesters facing to undertake a protest.
Okay. Well, if you go back some 40 to 45 years ago, and particularly since 1976, people who have been our conscience, those young people in Soweto were the conscience of our nation, divided as it was, oppressed as it was, discriminated as it was. And they took to the streets to voice their opposition to something that they did not want imposed on them, and that was Afrikaans as a medium of instruction. Now, we have the same thing happening over time, where protesters, there's a protest, people mobilize, and the community gets informed that, look, there is going to be something happening in Chawela. Tomorrow from 8 a.m. we're going to be protesting. So people have noticed often that these things are happening. And especially now with social media, they have the ability to note that something is happening in their neighborhood, and they should be taking precautions to avoid those areas or stand in support of those protesters. They often concern all of us. It does concern you, it does concern us. When people anywhere in the country are unhappy about what is going on, are not happy with their situation, and therefore I think that we need to be much more responsive to our fellow citizens who are out there braving the cold. It's quite cold, braving the cold, doing what they are doing. And we, the minority, extreme minority, who are at work, tend to go about their business as if this is not my concern. It is very much your and my concern when something is happening around us and is not put right. You cannot, as the media, continue to get these plaintive calls for help, and that's the only place that people are getting heard, because you air those comments. Elsewhere, they don't get heard. And so can you imagine the pent-up fury when you're out there, you're braving everything to stand up for something that is your right, you're entitled to it. Right. Our Constitution says all these services must be provided.
Absolutely. Professor Saths Cooper, President of the Pan-African Psychology Union, thank you so much for just elaborating on the very complicated and somewhat volatile mind of a protester.